Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Department of English, Rajnagar Mahavidyalaya, Rajnagar, Birbhum, West Bengal, this is Mahinur Khatun welcoming you to the fifth session of the remote lecture series, Confab 2021. Today, we are pleased to be with us Dr. Shilpi Boshak, Assistant Professor, Department of English, সুধীর রঞ্জন লাহিড়ী মহাবিদ্যালয় মাঝদিয়া নদিয়া Dr. Shilpi Boshak is personally known to me. She has done her master's in 2010 from the University of Kolani. She has done her doctoral research on the poems of the famous Kashmiri American poet Aga Shahid Ali in 2020 from the University of Gorbanga. She has been teaching English as an assistant professor at Sudhir Ranjan Lahiri Mahavidyalaya for the last 6 years. Her areas of interest include post-colonial studies, Indian English literature, and new gender studies. Now, today, she is going to speak on post-colonial studies, that is on our undergraduate syllabus. So, without any delay, let me request our honorable speaker, Dr. Shilpi Boshak, to address us. Over to you, madam.
Thank you, Mahinur. First of all, a very good morning to everybody present here. I'm really happy to share the virtual space with all of you. And thank you, organizers of Confab 2021, for inviting me to deliver this talk on post-colonialism. First of all, I must admit that post-colonialism and post-colonial studies is a vast field of study, and it is almost impossible to cover all aspects in a 1-hour lecture. So I would touch upon only the key aspects of post-colonial studies. And then I will divide my talk into 4 parts. But first of all, allow me a minute to share the screen first. Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. So as you see, the title of the talk is Post-Colonial Studies in Perspective. Now, I have divided my talk into 4 parts. First, I will talk about the definitions of key terms like colonialism, imperialism, post-coloniality, and post-colonialism. Then I will talk about the transition from post-colonialism to post-colonial studies or post-colonial criticism. Then I will talk on the important terms and concepts that are very much integral to the post-colonial studies like Eurocentrism and Orientalism, nation and nationalism, and diaspora and transnationalism. Then I will go through the 4 key thinkers or theories of post-colonial studies: Fanon, Franz Fanon, Edward Said, Shomike Bhabha, and lastly, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. So, this is my plan today. Now, let me come to the first slide. I have written here indefinite definitions of metacritical take. Now, what does metacritical mean? Metacritical mean that it is based on the criticism of others. Here I have provided definitions taken from the other critics, taken from different ways. And why indefinite? Because all the definitions are incomplete in a sense or partial in a sense, because these definitions cannot account for or cannot take into account all the aspects related to post-colonialism or colonialism. So I have called it indefinite definitions. And another reason for calling it indefinite is that each definition is involved, because there are many terms, many realities, many concepts associated with this phenomenon. Take, for example, post-colonialism. First comes colony, then when it becomes part of the many acquisitions of the mother country, then it becomes part of an empire. Sorry. Now, when we talk about post-colonialism, the first thing that we come across is colonialism. So now comes the term colonialism. What is colonialism? According to Oxford English Dictionary, colonialism comes from the Roman colonia, which meant farm or settlement. A settlement in a new country, a body of people who settle in a new locality, forming a community subject to or connected with their parent state. The community so formed, consisting of the original settlers and their descendants and successors, as long as the connection with the parent state is kept up. Now, this definition avoids any reference to the people other than the colonizers. Now, obviously, you see, when the colonizers come to a new place, a new locality, the new locality must not be vacant. It must be inhabited by some people, indigenous people. So there must be some confrontation between the indigenous people and the colonizers. But in this definition, we cannot find this aspect. So I tell that every definition is only partial or incomplete. Now, this aspect of encounter between the original inhabitants and the newcomers, the colonizers, have been mentioned in this definition provided by Ania Lobba. As you see in the screen, colonialism locked the original inhabitants and the newcomers into the most complex and traumatic relationships in human history. Now, colonialism was not an identical process, and it took various forms in various parts of the world. Now, you see the process of forming a new community involves a process of unforming and reforming the communities. And this involved a wide range of things like settlements, like plundering, like negotiation, like genocide, warfare. And this takes us to the next definition of colonialism, that we can define colonialism as the conquest and control of other people's land and goods. Now, come to the next term, imperialism. Colonialism and imperialism, these two terms are used interchangeably, but they are not the same. I will talk about the difference later, but first come to the definition. The Old English Dictionary defines imperialism as the rule of an emperor, especially where despotic or arbitrary, the principle or spirit of empire, advocacy of what are held to be imperial interests, or a political system in which imperial center governs colonized countries. Here, what happens? Imperial country is the metropolis from which the power flows, and it penetrates and controls the colonized countries. Now, as I said, that there is a key difference between imperialism and colonialism. What is that? That imperialism can function without former colonies. Think about the neo-imperialism of America. Act without any colony per se. But colonialism cannot act without colony. So this is the key difference between colonialism and imperialism. Come to the next term, post-coloniality. Simply said, post-coloniality is the cultural condition of post-colonial society or post-colonialism. Now this takes us to the term post-colonialism. What is post-colonialism? Now there is a confusion whether we should use hyphen between post and colonialism or we should use it as a single word. Now if we use hyphen, it acts as a temporal marker signifying that something is coming after something, and so it creates a break. Now, if we use hyphen, it means that the period coming after colonization, end of colonization, or coincides with the decolonization or freedom of the colonial countries. For example, if we think about India, then if we use hyphen, then we will see that post-colonialism period begins in 1947. But critics like V. Ashcroft or Anya Lumba, they are of the opinion that it is more helpful to think of post-colonialism not just as coming literally after colonialism and signifying its demise, but more flexibly as the contestation of colonial domination and the legacies of colonialism. Why so? Because there is a continuity of preoccupations throughout the historical process initiated by European imperial aggression. So now we come to the next slide, which deals with the transition between from post-colonialism to post-colonial criticism or post-colonial study. Now, what post-colonial study or post-colonial criticism does is that it utilizes the insights and tools of post-colonialism and basically highlights the issues of cultural differences or stupid hierarchization that is done by the Orientalists. So, for example, when we analyze a text, a colonial text, for example, Tempest or Robinson Crusoe from post-colonial perspective, then we bring to the fore the discrepancies embedded in the text. Now, theories of colonial discourse have been fundamental to the development of post-colonialism as an academic practice. In general, they explore the ways that representation and modes of perception are used as fundamental weapons of colonial power to keep colonized people subservient to colonial rule. Now, it has both good sides and bad sides. What is its asset? Its asset is that post-colonialism tries to interrogate colonialism as a discourse by interrogating and negotiating the point of intersection between the colonizer's ideology and the colonized subjectivity. And because colonial discourse always presupposes some kind of menacing binary, us versus them, civilized versus savage, and a kind of typecast hierarchy, superior versus inferior, etc. So what happens? Post-colonialism as a response to colonialism and a critique to colonialism and a byproduct, it gives us a chance and an intellectual discursive space, an agency to liberate the voice of the voiceless, the subaltern, the underprivileged, because the colonized people are always the underprivileged people. Now, what are the liabilities or its limitation is that it became a very close-knit, fixed at a historical cultural point or moment. Hence, we see that at a later stage, diaspora studies, which was primarily a part of post-colonial studies, it comes out from post-colonial criticism and takes a completely different route. Now, having done this portion, I will talk about important terms and concepts integral to the post-colonial studies. Now, the terms and concepts I will talk on. First, I'll talk on Eurocentrism and Orientalism, then nation and nationalism, then diaspora and nationalism. What is Eurocentrism? Eurocentrism is the discourse that places emphasis on European concerns, culture and values at the expense of those of other cultures. So everything when it is seen from the perspective of Europe, that is called Eurocentrism. Now, Eurocentrism assumes that Europe is civilized and has been throughout history, and that European civilization has a unique historical advantage that leads to its permanent superiority over all other cultures. Now, what is Orientalism? I'll talk about it in detail when I will deal with Edward Said, but here I have written briefly about Orientalism. Orientalism refers to the study of the Orient as opposed to the Occident, the West. It was the publication of the seminal work Orientalism by the Palestinian American Edward Said in 1978 that marked a new era in the use of the term. And this publication is not only an important text in the study of colonialism, but also in the study of cultural, in the field of cultural studies. Now, Said's Orientalism, elaborating on Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony and Michel Foucault's theorization of discourse and the close relationship between knowledge and power, revolutionized the study of whole region of the Middle East and shaped new fields of study such as post-colonial theory. In fact, Orientalism is something premised upon exteriority because it has been constructed. How constructed? By the nexus between power and knowledge, as said by Edward Said. Now, the next important concepts I'll talk about: nation and nationalism. Here I have given three definitions of nation. First, Ernest Rene, he says that nation is not quote-unquote natural entities and that it is constructed. Benedict Anderson says about nation that it is an imagined political community, and Taylor says that it is a living entity, a desire. So this betrays the fact that nation is something very much constructed. And we have seen this when we have read the novel Shadowlands by Amitabh Ghosh, that nation and nationalism, they are very fragile, and they're how to put it, they are very much constructed and they are very much fragile. Now, nationalism is, as put by Srinivas Iyengar, is an awakening of a nation to self-consciousness. How did it emerge first? It emerged, particularly in post-colonial countries, it emerged as a political and intellectual movement led by a broad spectrum of social elites with a common interest in liberating the nation from colonial rule and in establishing an independent nation state with a distinct, united national identity. So, in post-colonial state, nationalism emerged as anti-colonial nationalism or resistant nationalism. Now, what is the relationship between post-colonial literature and the nation question? How does post-colonial literature respond to the question, to the nation question, the concept of nationalism? Post-colonial literature either valorizes or critiques. It interrogates the nation and nationalism as political, cultural, and historical entities and problematizes the notion of nation and nationalism. As I have just said, that you will see these concepts when you will read The Shadow Lies by Amitabh Ghosh. And it brings to the fore the new margins as they are conceived on majoritarian lines and affords the cause of those marginalized quote-unquote other. Now, post-colonialism ought to facilitate the emergence of an enlightened post-nationalism. This has been said by Edward Said, that post-colonialism ought to go beyond nationalism. The possibility of a more generous and pluralistic vision of the world. Now, diaspora and transnationalism, they are very much integral to the post-colonial studies. How? I'll talk about it. First, diaspora comes from the Greek word. It is a Greek word etymologically, dia and spora. Dia means across and spora means sow, S-O-W. So it means to disperse. Now it may be voluntary or it may be forced. So diaspora is the voluntary or forcible movement of peoples from their homelands into new regions is a central historical fact of colonization. And colonialism itself was a radically diasporic movement involving the temporary or permanent dispersion and settlement of millions of Europeans over the entire land. And if we think about the settled regions, then we will see that many such settled regions have developed historically as plantations or agricultural colonies, where there was the demand of laborers. And when the local people could not supply the need, then what happened? There was the supply of indentured labor, or there was also the practice of slavery. In fact, Indian populations form a number of diasporic people in West Indies or Fiji or Mauritius or South Africa. In Amitabh Ghosh's Sea of Poppies, we see such indentured laborer going to the settled countries by the sea. Now, an important feature of diaspora is that diasporic people, they share a common heritage, though scattered across different parts of the world. Now, the descendants of diasporic movements generated by have developed their own distinct cultures, which both preserve and often extend and develop their originary cultures. Originary means original. The development of diasporic culture necessarily questions essential models interrogating the ideology of a unified natural cultural form, one that underpins the center margin model of colonialist discourse. It also postulates the simpler kind of theories of nativism, which suggests that decolonization can be effected by a recovery or reconstruction of pre-colonial societies. Because actually, decolonization cannot be effected by a recovery or reconstruction of pre-colonial societies. We cannot go back to a quote-unquote pure state which was quote-unquote uncontaminated by the colonial interaction. I am quoting from Rushdie from his collection of essays, Imaginary Homelands. It may be that writers in my position, exiles or immigrants or expatriates, are haunted by some sense of loss, some urge to reclaim, to look back, even at the risk of being mutated into pillars of salt. But if we do look back, we must also do so in the knowledge which gives rise to profound uncertainty that our physical alienation from India almost inevitably means that we will not be capable of reclaiming precisely the thing that was lost. So I was talking about that the past cannot be wholly recovered, wholly reclaimed, because it has already been changed in the process. That will, in short, create fictions, not actual cities or villages, but invisible ones, imaginary homelands, Indias of the mind. Now come to the term transnationalism. Although both the terms transnationalism and diaspora refer to cross-border processes, but diaspora has been often used to denote religious or national groups living outside an country, an imagined country, whereas transnationalism is often used both as migrants' double ties across countries, or more widely, all sorts of social formations such as transnationally active networks, groups, and organizations. So, transnationalism examines the effects of the mobility of people, technologies, ideas, capital, commodities on contemporary intellectual life, societies, cultural and literary practices. It highlights transcultural and diasporic experiences that exceed national, racial, religious, and linguistic boundaries, and challenges traditional literary and humanities scholarship that reinforce the classification of text and culture in terms of national and regional literatures. Here I have quoted from Janine Dahinden from the book Diaspora and Transnationalism. The two key concepts of transnationalism is mobility and locality. I am reading the whole quote. My central argument is that transnational formations result from a combination of transnational mobility on the one hand and locality in the sending or and receiving country on the other. Mobility is to be understood here as the physical movement of people in transnational space. Locality means being rooted or anchored socially, economically, or politically in the country of immigration and or in the sending country. It means developing or having a set of social relations at specific places. Looking at transnational formations as the effect of combination of these two dimensions, mobility and locality, provides interesting insights into the multiplicities and forms of existence. So as I said that the two key characteristics of transnationalism is that it has to be both mobile, it needs to be mobile, it has to be root or anchored in the country of immigration, and also it has to be a kind of mobility in the sending or receiving country. Now I'll talk about the four key thinkers or theorists of post-colonialism or post-colonial studies. Now first I'll talk about Frantz Fanon. Fanon was a Martinican psychologist and writer whose critique of colonialism draws on a broad range of disciplines, including philosophy, psychology, social anthropology, and literature. His first book, Black Skin, White Mask, published in 1952, a landmark text in the analysis of colonialism, demonstrates the extent to which racist values are internalized by the colonized and the psychological damage suffered by colonized people who internalized this colonial discourse. In a narrative both inspiring and distressing, he remembers how he felt in France when white strangers pointed out his blackness with derogatory phrases such as dirty nigger or look a negro. Now, Black Skin, White Mask, it explains the consequence of identity formation for the colonized subject who is forced into the internalization of the self as an other. The Negro is deemed to epitomize everything that the colonizing French are not. The colonizers are civilized, rational, intelligent. The Negro remains other to all these qualities against which colonizing people derive their sense of superiority and normality. The white wall, writes Fanon, the only honorable one, barred me from all participation. A man was expected to behave like a man. I was expected to behave like a black man. Now, Fanon, he was a psychiatrist and the chief of staff at a psychiatric hospital in Algeria in 1953, and he had first-hand experience of the psychological wound created by the internal colonizing of the mind. এখানে আমি একটা রেফারেন্স দেব, স্যাম সিলভান, a writer from Trinidad, তার ছোটবেলার একটা গল্প তিনি একটা লেকচারে বলছেন। তিনি বলছেন যে আমাদের গ্রামে একজন বোটম্যান ছিলেন। সেই বোটম্যানের নাম ছিল স্যামি, এবং he was half paralyzed and he was often the laughing stock of the children. One day what happened, ওই স্যামি বলে লোকটা কোনো একজন হোয়াইট ম্যানকে সাথে, possibly that white man was an escaped convict, এবং ওকে অ্যাসিস্ট্যান্ট হিসেবে কাজে লাগে। তো এটাতে যখন স্যাম সিলভান ছোট ছিলেন তখন he was furious. Why? কারণ ওর কাছে মনে হচ্ছে যে দিস ইজ নট দ্য নর্মালাইজড, ওটা নর্মালাইজড কন্ডিশন, দিস ইজ নট দ্য ওয়ে ওয়ার্ল্ড ওয়ার্কস। কারণ হোয়াইট ম্যান সে তো মাস্টার হবে, হোয়াইট ম্যান কেন অ্যাসিস্ট্যান্ট হবে? হোয়াইট ম্যান মাস্টার হবে এবং তার আন্ডারে ওই ব্ল্যাক ম্যান কাজ করবে। এবং পরে যখন উনি বড় হয়ে নিচ্ছেন তখন বলছেন আমাকে কিন্তু কেউ শেখায়নি, আমাকে কিন্তু কোনো কলোনিয়াল ডিসকোর্স ইন্ডোক্ট্রিনেশন হয়নি, বাট this is the damage, this is the psychological damage, and this is the internalization, this is the colonizing of the mind, how it happens. Now, Fanon's other books like A Dying Colonialism, published in 1959, and The Wretched of Art, published in 1961, showed sympathy with the Algerian independence movement. As I said that he was posted in Algeria once, So he had sympathy with the Algerian independence movement and argued that violence was necessary in the struggle against colonialism, not simply to effect revolutionary change, but also an act of psychic emancipation for the colonized subject. His impact on post-colonial thinking has been considerable, and both theorists such as Honike Bhabha and writers such as Derek Walcott demonstrate an indebtedness to his works. Edward Said was one of the most influential post-colonial theorists. Was born in Jerusalem and attended school in Cairo between 1948 and 1951 before migrating to the United States. While Said's work is wide-ranging, both in terms of its historical and geographical sweep and its disciplinary coverage, it is rooted in literature and cultural theory. His analysis of the discursive constitution of power hegemony draws on the work of Antonio Gramsci and Michel Foucault. Said's most famous work, Orientalism, the full title Orientalism, Western Conceptions of the Orient, published in 1978, deals with the West's discursive construction of the East. I am quoting from Orientalism. Much of the personal investment in this study, means in the study of Orientalism, derives from my awareness of being an Oriental as a child growing up in two British colonies. All my education in those colonies, Palestine and Egypt, and in the United States, has been Western, and yet that deep early awareness has persisted. In many ways, my study of Orientalism has been an attempt to invent the traces upon me, the Oriental subject of the culture whose domination has been so powerful a factor in the life of all Orientals. Now, if we read Said's Orientalism and look at the epigraph, then one of the epigraph is from Karl Marx. And we know Karl Marx as a Messiah of the poor and downtrodden people. But he said in here that they, means East, cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. So the colony cannot represent itself, it has to be represented. And who will represent? Obviously the Westerners. Now think about it. When I represent you from my own perspective. I represent you based on my interests. I represent you based on my understanding of you. So the representation obviously must not be neutral. It would be partial and it would be distorted. Because there is a difference. There is many differences. There is a difference of location, means spatial difference, there is a cultural difference, there is political difference, there is ideological difference, and all these will come into the construction of the Orient by the Westerners. So, with the Orient perceived as inferior, obviously its colonization could be justified as a civilization that saves people from their own perceived barbarism. Now, Said examined how knowledge of the Western imperial power formed about their colonies helped continually to justify their subjugation. He said, I have quoted from the very first chapter, Scope of Orientalism, from the book Orientalism. To have such knowledge of such a thing is to dominate it, to have authority over it. Here, we may remember Foucault's famous postulation that knowledge is power. And authority here means for us to deny autonomy to it, the Oriental country, since we know it and it exists in a sense as we know it. So it exists why? Because we know it, as said by the Westerners or as constituted by the early Orientalists. Now, Said said that Western nations like France and Britain, they spent enormous amount of time and money to produce knowledge about the locations they dominated. তোমরা হয়তো নেপোলিয়ন বোনাপার্টের ইজিপ্ট এক্সপেডিশনের কথা শুনে থাকবে, যেখানে নেপোলিয়ন বোনাপার্ট প্রায় 1000-এর উপর লোক পাঠিয়েছিলেন শুধুমাত্র ইজিপ্ট সম্পর্কে জানার জন্য, ইজিপ্ট সম্পর্কে ইনফরমেশন কালেক্ট করার জন্য, যেটা পরবর্তীকালে একটা বই আকারে বেরিয়েছিল, ডেসক্রিপশন অফ দ্য ইজিপ্ট বাই ফিউরো। সেখানে উনি ইঞ্জিনিয়ার পাঠিয়েছিলেন, এনগ্রেভার্স পাঠিয়েছিলেন, ইন্টেলেকচুয়ালস পাঠিয়েছিলেন, অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিস্ট পাঠিয়েছিলেন। কেন এত খরচা করেছিলেন, এত কিছু কেন? কারণ knowledge will give you power. Knowledge will give you power and it will give you easy access to the colony and to the colonial people. So we see, but their knowledge was not quote unquote true. Why? Because they did not interact with the native people. Their knowledge was not based on the encounter with the native peoples. Rather, their knowledge was based upon some assumptions that Orient is a mythic place of exoticism, it is a place of moral laxity, it is a place of sexual degeneration, and so on and so forth. And these observations were rather later turned into scientific truths to justify the very propriety of colonial domination. Thus, colonialism continuously perpetuated itself. Colonial power was buttressed by the production of knowledge about colonized cultures, which endlessly produced a degenerate image of the Orient for those in the West or Occident. Now, Homi K. Bhabha was one of the most influential of post-colonial theorists. He was born in 1949 into Parsi community of Mumbai, and don't confuse Homi K. Bhabha with Homi Jahangir Bhabha. Homi Jahangir Bhabha was a scientist যার নামে ভাবা অ্যাটমিক রিসার্চ সেন্টার আছে। আর আমরা যে হোমি ভাবার কথা পড়ব উনি হচ্ছেন হোমি কে ভাবা। So Homi K. Bhabha, he belongs to the Parsi community of Mumbai and was educated at the University of Bombay and at Christ Church College, Oxford. He has taught at universities of Sussex, Chicago, and Harvard. Two of his most influential books are A Location of Culture, published in 1994, and Nation and Narration, published in 1990. Now, I will talk about the three key concepts of Bhabha. First, ambivalence, then hybridity, and then mimicry. Hello? Am I audible? Hello?
Hello, Raju, to speak, please mute your mic, microphone.
Yes, there is some disturbance happening.
Yes, it's now
Okay. So what is ambivalence? According to Bhabha, the colonized are both fascinating and frightening to the colonizers. They are domesticated, explicable, knowable, and at the same time they are wild, mysterious, harmful. And Baba argues that within colonialist representation, the colonized subject is always in motion, sliding ambivalently between the polarities of similarities and difference, rationality and fantasy. He or she will simply not stand still. Hence, there is the prevalence of stereotypes in colonial discourse. Why? Because it is an attempt to secure the colonized subject within the discourse of colonialism. As Bhabha puts it, I quote, the same old stories of the Negro's animality, the coolie's inscrutability, or the stupidity of the Irish must be told compulsively again and afresh, and are differently gratifying and terrifying each time. The repetition of the colonial stereotype in an attempt to secure the colonized in a fixed position. But it also, in a way, an acknowledgement that this fixity, this fixation can never be achieved. So this is the idea of ambiguities. Now come to the concept of hybridity. In colonial discourse, colonialism is constructed by the West as a civilizing mission where colonizer is seen as superior and colonized are seen as inferior. And this superior-inferior binary indicates that despite the encounter, despite the colonial contact, the culture and civilization of the Western colonizer and the colonized East were perceived as two distinct and separate entities. And this perception is very clearly noticeable in the famous lines of Rudyard Kipling's poem, The Ballad of East and West, where he says, East is East and West is West, and never shall the twain meet. So, this reminds us the nationalist project of going back or reverting to the quote-unquote original, quote-unquote pure Indian culture. Now, Bhabha says that this pure culture, the idea of pure culture is a myth. And the idea of pure culture, it cannot exist because it cannot be separated from the foreign culture. Because for Bhabha, culture is something that is not static. It is always in a flux. It is not an essence that can be fixed in time and space. On the contrary, it is something very fluid. As I said, always in motion. So, there is no pure Indianness or no pure Britishness that can be grasped. So, notion of cultural unity is a myth, and all culture, according to Bhabha, is characterized by change, by flux, transformation, and most importantly, by a mixedness or a kind of interconnectedness that Bhabha calls hybridity. So, and it is a very important concept in the post-colonial studies. Now, what is mimicry? Bhabha describes mimicry as one of the most elusive and effective strategies of colonial power and knowledge. He focuses on the fact that in colonial locations such as India, the British authorities required the native people to work on their behalf and thus had to teach them English language. We all know about the 1835 minutes by Lord Macmillan, where he said that colonial government spent more money on English education in India so as to quote, create a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Now, the problem of the project is that if the project is ever to succeed, then it will erase the assumed cultural gap between the superior British and the inferior India, and thereby undermine the entire colonial process. And the justification of the civilizing mission will not work. So, according to Bhabha, the colonizer wants the colonized to mimic him, to imitate him, he never really expects the latter to catch him, to catch up. The mimic men of the colonial periphery are therefore, from the perspective of the colonizer, people who forever remain, to quote Bhabha's phrase, not quite, not quite. So they are almost like the British, but not like the British. Never really like the British. And this never really like the British is important because it maintains the assumed cultural gap between a superior colonizer and an inferior colonized. Now, mimicry can also lead to mockery, to an exaggeration imitation, which comically undermines the colonizer and his superior civilizational position through a partial repetition. And here, in this way, we can say that mimicry has a subversive potential in it. It challenges the quote-unquote superior culture and suggests that it is not only quote-unquote the absolute. So mimicry, as I said, has a subversive potential in it. So, which Bhabha refers to as the menace of mimicry. Now I will come to the last theories. In fact, Spivak, Said and Bhabha, they are together called the Holy Trinity. So Spivak is the last person I will talk about in this lecture. Now, Spivak is an Indian cultural theorist, activist and translator. She studied at the University of Calcutta and Cornell University, where she was heavily influenced by the work of Plato. She did her PhD under the guidance of the famous personality Paul D. Mann, and she did her doctoral research on the poetry of W.B. Yeats. Now, her important publications are Of Grammatology, 1976, the important essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? First published was in 1985. It has several versions, but it was first published in 1985. Then in 1999, we have a critique of post-colonialism toward a history of the vanishing present. And then we have an aesthetic education in the era of globalization. Now, in this book, she interestingly introduces herself not only as a professor at Columbia as she is, but also she introduces herself as a trainer of elementary school teachers in West Bengal. And this particular aspect of her career as a trainer of elementary school teachers in West Bengal is important because, as we will soon see, that it relates to her efforts to create enabling conditions for the subaltern to speak. But let us first come to the term Subaltern. Who is a subaltern? Etymologically, it means information in military. But the term was adopted by Antonio Gramsci to refer to those groups in society who are subject to the hegemony of the ruling classes. The term has been later adopted to post-colonial studies from the work of Subaltern Studies group of historians led by Ranajit Guha, who aim to promote a systematic discussion of subaltern themes in South Asian studies. The subaltern here means the population who are not elite and who don't have any political or economic agency. The subaltern is in position of absolute social disempowerment, and Spivak argues that it is a position from which speech is not possible. Now, the statement that subaltern cannot speak, which is actually the answer to the question that is posited in the title of the essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, does not mean that they are physically dumb or speechless. Rather, the subaltern are someone who cannot generate meaningful utterances or discourse. Neither can they assert their own individual identity. Why? Because they have no agency within the society. And when they are represented by the intellectuals, what happens that their utterances gets mediated and appropriated by the utterances of the intellectuals, and gradually they are appropriated by the dominant discourse. So we cannot find their own distinctive voice or discourse. This is put by Spivak in this way, that in the context of colonial production, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak. The subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. Why? Because they are doubly colonized by colonizers and by patriarchy. And then she concludes the subaltern cannot speak. Now we'll come to the next concept of Spivak, strategic essentialism. But in order to understand what is strategic essentialism, we will first need to understand the term essentialism. Essentialism is the assumption that groups, categories or classes of objects have one or several defining features exclusive to all members of that category. মানে টাইপ কাস্ট করে দেওয়া, এসেনশিয়ালাইজ করে দেওয়া যে মেল তার মানে তার এই ফিচারগুলো থাকবে, ফিমেল তার মানে তার এই ফিচারগুলো থাকবে, এই রেস সুতরাং তার এই ফিচার্সগুলো থাকবে, এই কমিউনিটি সুতরাং তার এই ফিচারগুলো থাকবে। সুতরাং এটাকে বলে এসেনশিয়ালাইজ করে দেওয়া। এবং এই এসেনশিয়ালিজমের obviously you can see that essentialization is bad. Now, theories such as Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak obviously was against this kind of essentialism, and he drew attention to the dangers of assuming that it was a simple matter of allowing the subaltern, that is oppressed people, forced to speak without recognizing that their essential subjectivity has been and still was constrained by the discourses within which they were constructed as subaltern. Her controversial question, "Can the subaltern speak?" were frequently misinterpreted to mean that there was no way in which subaltern people could ever attain a voice. She did not mean that. In response to the negative interpretation of her earlier work, perhaps, and in an attempt to reassert the political force resident in her theory, Spivak spoke of the need to embrace a strategic essentialism. What is that? I have quoted, I think we have to choose again strategically, not universal discourse, but essentialist discourse. I think that since as a deconstructivist, I cannot in fact clean my hands and say I am specific. In fact, I must say that I am an essentialist from time to time. So strategic essentialism is about the need to accept temporarily temporarily an essentialist position in order to able to act. মানে strategic essentialism is a strategy where differences are temporarily downplayed and an unity is assumed for the sake of achieving a political goal. You can think about the time of election. What happens? Though the political parties have their quote unquote essential ideological differences, but they made coalition. Why? In order to achieve a political goal. So they temporarily they ignore the differences and unite. So strategic essentialism is the need to accept an essentialist position temporarily in order to be able to act. Now, the last concept I will talk about is othering. It is a process. The term was obviously coined by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. She means by the term a process by which imperial discourse creates its others. Othering describes the various ways in which the colonial discourse produces its subjects. In Spivak's explanation, othering is a dialectical process because the colonizing other is established at the same time as its colonized other are produced as subjects. So it is a two-way process. The colonizing other and the colonized other are produced at the same time. Where I would like to conclude, and I'll be very happy if there are questions and comments and observations.
Thank you, madam, for this wonderful presentation. I now invite questions and comments from the members of the audience. If you have any question, you may ask her, or you may send your questions in the chat box. Dear students, if you have any question, you may ask her. There is a question in the chat box from Bithi Dalal. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Okay. Ma'am, please explain the term transnationalism.
Transnationalism, we can say that it is an offshoot of globalization where it believes in the exchange of nations, believes in the interaction of nations in the context of globalization. Trans means here beyond nation, beyond the boundaries of nation. And it talks about the liminality of the boundaries. As I said, that the true important factors that define transnationalism is transnational mobility on the one hand, mobility to the sending country, to the country where a country of immigration, and locality in the mother country. So it has two qualities, both transnational mobility and transnational locality. And it believes or it encourages the transnational interaction between nations. You may have
Thank you.
at the same time ties with different countries. So that is transnational ties or transnational network, we often say. Any other question?
Thank you. There is no other question in the chat box. Any other question? Okay. On behalf of the organizers, I took this opportunity to thank today's speaker, Dr. Shilpi Bosha, for sparing her time for us. It was really an excellent session. I now make an important announcement that tomorrow we will come with a new speaker and a new topic. Dr. Monisha Sarkar Sinha, Assistant Professor of English, East Calcutta Girls College, Lake Town, Kolkata, is going to be with us tomorrow, and we'll talk about Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. So I hope to have your company or presence tomorrow at the same time, 11 a.m. by honor. And here we end the session. Thank you, madam. Thank you, everyone. Take care and stay safe.